Hello again. James Orr's Sidelights on Christian Doctrine, this chapter 8, Christ and Salvation. He's dealing with the atonement. I have alluded to the drift of the mind of the age away from the presuppositions of the biblical doctrine of atonement. This is a point on which there should be a clear understanding at the outset. There is no use studying the doctrine of atonement in the Bible unless we are prepared to do it in the light of the Bible's own presuppositions, especially in the light of its teaching on the character and holiness of God and on the sin of man. That God is holy, that he can never look on sin but with abhorrence and displeasure, can never call sin aught else but what it is, or tamper with the condemning testimony of his law against it. This on the one hand, and on the other, that sin is sin, a thing inherently evil, condemnable, punishable, and the result of voluntary transgression, laying the world and the individual transgressor under God's just condemnation. These are postulates of the doctrine of atonement, without the admission of which the doctrine becomes meaningless. If these presuppositions of the doctrine are denied, or are displaced by some modern view, which proceeds on opposite ideas, I despair of ever making the atonement appear real or reasonable. Take as examples the two presuppositions that have been mentioned, God's holiness and man's sin. Suppose that under the influence of some form of the doctrine of the fatherhood of God, the character of God as holy, judge of the world and punisher of sin, is called in question, or that under the influence of some evolutionary theory of man's origin, the gravity of sin is minimized, its guilt extenuated, the condemnation of God resting on the sinner weakened, or that on yet higher metaphysical grounds, sin is taken up into the world process and represented as a necessity of human development, an element in the life of God himself. Then, plainly, there is no basis left for a doctrine of atonement, and we need not wonder that men fight shy of it or scoff at it. It is on the basis of the biblical conception, not on those of non-biblical, philosophical, or scientific theories, that the study of the atonement is here approached. So approaching it, what must first strike the impartial student is how largely and vitally this doctrine enters into representations of both Old Testament and New. Many, it is to be feared, who discuss the subject have never taken the trouble to make a careful study of the Bible teaching in regard to it. They deal with it on general principles that commend themselves to their own minds and pay little heed to what the Bible itself has to say on the matter. This is a mistake, for the Bible throughout has a definite and coherent doctrine on atonement for sin, and those who give attention to it will probably be surprised to find how uniform and unambiguous are its teachings. The doctrine of propitiatory atonement is deeply inwrought into the structure of the Old Testament. It is found first and most prominently in the doctrine of sacrifice, which meets us from the beginning and has, even in its simplest form, that of the burnt offering, an expiatory significance, according to Job chapter 1, where we find Job offering sacrifices for both his own sin and that of his children, and also Job 42, at the very end of the book, where we find Job offering the same sacrifices. This before the law of Moses, by the way, according to the chronology of the Old Testament. The blood in which was the life was a sacred thing, and when presented to God, had a sin-covering efficacy, according to Leviticus 17. The covenants were ratified by sacrifice throughout the Torah. The blood of the Passover lamb, sprinkled on the doorposts and lintels, protected the Israelites from the destroyer. It is in the Levitical ritual, however, which there is no good reason for carrying down to post-exilian times, that the idea of propitiatory sacrifice attains to completed expression. Of divine appointment, the Levitical system is constructed for a definite end, that of mediating the approach of a people in whom there is sin to a holy God, and has, as a leading part of its design, the making atonement or propitiation for sin. This is constantly declared of the sacrifices, except in the case of the peace offerings, where in the imposition of hands and sprinkling of the blood, according to Leviticus 3, it is implied, that is, propitiation is implied. The word rendered to atone means literally to cover, the idea being that the blood presented on the altar covered the person of the sinner, or covered his sin from the eyes of the holy God. On the great day of atonement, the blood of the sin offering, shed for the sins of the people, was sprinkled upon the mercy seat, intercepting, as it were, the condemning testimony that rose up from the tables of the law beneath to God. The writer to the Hebrews illustrates with profound insight the significance of the law and the priesthood, as at once a foreshadowing of the good things to come and a temporary institute which had not the power of itself to effect that which it foreshadowed, according to chapters 9 and 10 of Hebrews. A different but equally instructive line of development is seen in the Psalms and prophets in the delineation of the righteous sufferer, which culminates in the definite taking over of the sacrificial idea of the law upon the servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53. In this wonderful chapter, the most explicit prediction of the sufferings and death of Christ in the Old Testament, you have a righteous sufferer too, one despised and rejected of men. But the distinctive thing is that his sufferings are now atoning, expiatory, a means of removal of the guilt of sin. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. His soul is made an offering for sin, or as the word literally is, a guilt offering. The word laid on him the iniquity of us all. He bears iniquities. He poured out his soul unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. His death is followed by a signal triumph. By the knowledge of him many are justified. He sees his seed, prolongs his days, rules and conquers. It is not surprising that this remarkable prophecy was often in the mind of Christ himself, and is frequently alluded to in the New Testament, especially in the early chapters of the book of Acts. So I'll put a link on your screen to a wonderful book by David Barron, that Hebrew Christian of the last century, who wrote, among many books on prophecy, a book on this chapter, or these chapters, because it starts in chapter 52 of Isaiah, the suffering servant of Isaiah. David Barron. And next time, the atonement in the New Testament.